Alright, so in this video I'm going to keep it fairly brief, just going to be a quick intro to the rise of the five families, specifically the Italian Sicilian Mafia, as it took root and grew in the United States in the early 20th century. So we're going to be looking at some of the main characters and how the Mafia took on its present form, the form that we're somewhat familiar with through films like The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Sopranos, and things like that. How did the Mafia in America come to be organized the way it is? So I'm going to take just a quick look at some of the main characters and events that led to the Mafia as we know it in popular culture. And I can get more in depth into some of these people and events in future videos. So it's important to note that even though the Mafia in America is typically associated with having taken root in New York, it was actually in New Orleans where we originally see Italian organized crime taking root. So with groups and gangs like the Black Hand. Now it wasn't nearly as organized as it would come to be later on. These were just loose gangs. These are groups of thugs that operated just kind of on their own, just doing extortion, shaking down local businesses for quote-unquote protection money, which is just, hey, if you don't pay us a certain amount, then something bad may happen to you or to your business. It'd be a shame if your building caught on fire and burned down, or it'd be a shame if we shot you, that kind of thing. And those are staples of the Mafia, sure, but there was no organization to it in those early days in New Orleans. Now, around 1890, I think it was in 1890, with the assassination of the police chief Hennessy in New Orleans, one thing that we see in The Godfather that they mention is that you don't ever kill a police captain. It's never been done. The family would be outcast, and that's always been kind of a taboo. It's not something that you resort to unless you absolutely have to in organized crime. But in the 1890s, or in the early 1890s, that's exactly what happened with the gangs in New Orleans, the organized or not so organized Italian gangs. That they ran into Chief Hennessy. They had some beef with him, and so they killed him. And of course, there was a very public outcry, outrage, and it brought on a lot of heat. So they had to kind of go underground and not really show themselves as much, and their power was greatly diminished. And so it was in the decades after that we started seeing more organized Italian gangster activity in places like New York. And of course, in the early 1900s, the turn of the 20th century, we had more and more Italian immigrants coming over. And so when you had the rise of Prohibition, when that took over in early 1920, then of course you had the rise of bootlegging and hijacking shipments of booze and selling it at a profit. I mean, these organized, semi-organized Italian gangs and Jewish gangs and Irish gangs in New York all got a piece of that action, and we saw it with the outfit in Chicago as well under Al Capone. And so really during the Prohibition era, it really just became a wasteland where you had all these gangsters killing each other, and it wasn't very organized at all, or not as organized as it would come to be. So From there, if you fast forward to 1930, 1931, we have what's known as the Castellamarese War. And I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that right, but the Castellamarese War. The two big bosses in New York, and now we're mainly just focusing on the Italians here. In New York, you had Joe the Boss, Joe Masseria, who is in the upper right-hand corner right there, and then Maranzano, who is in the photo there to the left. So those are the two big bosses in New York at this time, and they're competing for control of liquor, gambling, all this kind of stuff. And so to make a long story short, a war breaks out between these two. And you had these young up-and-comers like Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Tommy Three Finger Brown, Lucchese. You had all these young up-and-comers that looked at these old-timers that they referred to as Mustache Pete's. And we're like, hey, these guys are stuck in their old ways of doing things. We can do better. And so they basically played Masseria and Maranzano against each other. They helped Maranzano win the war, but then they turn around and betray Maranzano and killed him. And so then Lucky Luciano took over. Now, one thing that Maranzano had done before they killed him was that he had structured a hierarchy that, as far as rankings in his outfit, in his crime outfit, that was based on an old Roman Empire military organization. So this is something that the mob would continue using and that they use presumably up to this day. But what Lucky Luciano and the others did once they took out Masseria and Maranzano was they established what was known as the commission. So that's where they all sat down and they divided up territories, saying, okay, this is our territory, this will be this family's territory, this will be that family's territory, and no one can interfere in other people's territories. No one can take a piece of whatever bootlegging, racketeering, extortion, prostitution, whatever it is that you're into. You have free reign in those areas in your territory. So your territory might be the Bronx, or it might be Brooklyn or Manhattan or what have you. And so they established the commission where they made these agreements. And another part of the commission, one thing that made the commission different from what had come before, and it made things more organized, was if you have to whack somebody, if you have to take someone out, you can't do it without the permission of the commission. You can't just have these guys going around killing each other willy-nilly, because we don't want to start a war, because wars are bad for business. So with the commission, you have to have their blessing before you can take somebody out. And you have to have a good cause, a reasonable complaint against something that somebody had done. If it's a made person, you have to get permission from your boss, and that boss has to get permission from the other guy's boss in order to make it all good, to make it all legal as far as in terms of the five families. So the commission was made up of the five major families in New York. So you had Gambino, Bonanno, Colombo, Lucchese, and Genovese. So those were the five families that made up the commission. And so under the commission, everything was highly regulated. The heads of the five families would come and meet up so often. We saw sort of a version of this portrayed in The Godfather, where Vito Corleone and Tattaglia Emilio Barzini, the heads of these mafia families all came together and met in the big room at this bank, and they all had their their bodyguards and their consiglieres there with them. And so that was based on these meetings that were held by the commission, where they would divide up territory and they would agree on what could or couldn't be done and things like that. So one thing that was brought over by Maranzano even before the commission was established, but the commission carried it on and just continued to be part of the mafia hierarchy. It's a model that they've stuck with. Is at the top you have the Don, who is the boss, and then second in command under him is you have the underboss, and then someone who's at really the same rank as the underboss, but is sort of the Don's right hand man, would be the consigliere, who acts as a counselor to the Don, and as the name suggests, and gives the Don advice on what's the right move to make. So like in The Godfather, that would have been Tom Hagen. Although something like that would never be allowed in the mafia in real life, because Tom Hagen was not Sicilian. You had to be Sicilian to be part of one of these families. So you had the boss, the underboss, the consigliere, and then you had the captains, also known as the capo regime. And these were the overseers of each of the capo regimes had their own crews. And the crews were made up of soldiers and associates. And so under each capo regime you had soldiers. The soldiers were also known as button men. And so the job of a soldier was to go out and earn. You had to be a good earner. And you would earn money by, you would get money from prostitution, money from gambling, from loan sharking. You would get all these different sources of revenue, and then everything that you got, you kicked up part of that to your capo, and then the capo would kick it up to the boss. So the boss would get a piece of all of that. And so each capo regime had his own group of soldiers that would be going out and and shaking down different small businesses and doing all these different things to bring in money. And the soldiers would also be button men, which are also known as hit men. So if you were a button man, you would carry out a hit if your capo regime told you to. And so you had all these different layers of authority. And one thing that did, it helped insulate the boss and make the boss invulnerable to prosecution, because the boss would give the order to the consigliere would tell the capo would then tell the soldier, okay, go do that, go kill that guy or whatever. But you could never trace it back to the boss, because there was never any direct contact between the boss and the soldiers. It would always go through the captains. And so the other reason why this functioned so well for so long was because of the code of omerta. That's a blood oath. And so if you were in order to become a soldier, you would have to, to even get in the family and be a member in the first place, you would have to get made. So you hear if you're ever watching any kind of movies or TV shows dealing with the mob, it's the goal is to get made and to be part of that organization. And in order to do that, you have to first work as an associate. So I forgot to mention, under the soldiers you had associates, and associates could be anybody. It could be it could be guys that an associate would work with the mob but not necessarily work for the mob, or they might work for the mob but just not be an actual made member. And so you were more vulnerable to getting whacked or getting thrown in jail or whatever. You had less protection as an associate, but you had to start out as an associate first and prove yourself. So if you were if you were, so even guys like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, these guys were, they couldn't be actually part of the mob because they were Jews. They were not actual Sicilians. And so guys like that were considered associates. Now, of course, Meyer Lansky and Hyman Roth, or not Hyman Roth, but the Rothstein, Arnold Rothstein, who Hyman Roth was in The Godfather, was character was based off of, was, the guys like that were extremely wealthy and very high profile, and they wielded a lot of power, but they could still be just considered associates because they weren't actually in the organization. But if you were an associate and you were a Sicilian, you wanted to work your way up into the family, then you had to first be a good earner. You had to prove yourself as a good earner. You had to prove yourself as someone who would follow orders. And associates could also be button men, hit men. You could be an enforcer. So an associate that proved himself over time through carrying out hits, you hear the term major bones. If you make your bones, it means you do something like carry out a hit and do it successfully. And something else that looked really good on you if you were an associate wanting to get made was, if you were arrested and did some prison time, and then once you got out, that would look really good on you if you didn't talk, if you didn't rat. So if you got caught, you took your lumps, you went to prison, you got out, that would really help your case too. And so if you were selected then to become part of the mob, like one of these mob families, then you would be given it was a ceremony. You'd be given a card with a picture of a saint on it, and while you were holding that card in your hand, it would be lit on fire, and you would repeat an oath. You would take a blood oath and say, if I ever betray my family, may I burn in hell like this saint. And so that was the ceremony, and that was the blood oath called omerta. And of course, in organized crime, being a rat's the worst thing you can possibly be, so they make you take that oath. And for many decades, that really meant something. But part of the reason why the mob lost so much power during the 80s and 90s, and why today, I know it still exists, but it's not nearly as powerful as it was. Like in the 1970s was the golden age. That was really the heyday of the mob. They no longer have that kind of power because so many guys turned and talked. So they got in whenever they got pinched, whenever they got brought in by the cops. You had more and more guys that would just sing like a canary, and then they would get put in witness protection, and so you had a lot of high-ranking mobsters taken down that way because more and more guys started breaking the code of omerta. The reason for that is because they got involved in drugs. When the mob got more and more involved in drugs, well, then you're not just getting sent away to prison for a couple of years. I mean, you're going away for a long, long, long time. And so a lot of dudes were just like, hey, rather than go to prison for the rest of my life, I'll just talk because I really got nothing to gain by keeping my mouth shut. And so really it was increased involvement in the drug trade that led to more and more mob guys breaking the code of omerta and talking, and based on that information, then law enforcement was able to bring in higher ranking mobsters as a big part of the reason why the mob was taken down and why it lost so much of its power and why you don't hear nearly as much about it today. And in The Godfather, we see a reference to that too, right? They keep trying to get the other families try to get the Corleone family involved in drugs, and Vito Corleone doesn't want to because he recognizes that, hey, once we get involved in drugs, it's not going to, it's just going to hurt us in the long run. And that's completely fictional. I mean, in real life, the five families very eagerly got into the drug trade because it was an easy way to make money. But again, the trade-off resulting from that was that, again, it's not like when you get brought in for prostitution or illegal gambling or from for shaking someone down and extorting someone. It wasn't like these kinds of things. Being involved in drug trafficking was just a whole new or a whole different level of punishment that you'd be looking at. You'd be looking at much longer prison terms. So a lot of guys just chose to talk instead of keeping silent and keeping with their code of omerta. But if you got made, and if you took that oath and became a soldier, then you were protected, right? So if you did get thrown in prison, if you had to go, which was a normal thing, you go to prison for for a time, and your mob family would provide for your wife or girlfriend, kids, whatever, to make sure everything was taken care of while you were in there. And then of course once you got out, you got a big party thrown and all this kind of stuff, assuming you didn't talk. And you were also immune from getting whacked by members of other families. Now of course if you talked, if you betrayed the family, then of course you were going to get whacked. But as far as getting killed by rival families, that had to go through the commission. That's part of what we were talking about earlier with the commission. If you were made, you could not be assassinated without approval by the commission. Like all the bosses had to approve across the board before you could be killed. And that was so you had that level of protection as a soldier. So that's all I'm going to cover in this video. So again, that was just the beginnings, the roots of the mob in America and the way that the mob works as far as its basic functions, its income, its why it succeeded for so long and why it ultimately lost so much of its power. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's any topics that I mentioned or didn't mention, things you want to hear more about, things you want future videos about, let me know in the comments section down below. Thank you very much.